When I saw their fear, I rose and spoke to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, fight for your sons, fight for your daughters, for your wives, and for your houses and your families. Can you imagine a host of men of all races gathered together, equipped, unafraid, and ready to fight for their families, ready to fight for their communities, ready to fight for their churches? Can you just imagine when Paul tells the Corinthians to be strong in the faith, and he tells the men to act like men? All brothers gathered together saying, let's fight for our families. Let's take back what has been broken in our communities by standing up and being the men that God has called us to be. First of all, recognizing that we've got to be men of the Word of God. That Jesus Christ said that man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of the Father. And therefore we gather together as men to hear the Word of God, to get instruction from God, to learn how to live our very lives by the Word of God, to accept the divine responsibility that God has given us to be leaders of our wives, leaders of our children, leaders in the church in terms of being men of prayer, servants in terms of elders and deacons inside the church. I just can't imagine this, because here it is that if we as brothers come together and get equipped by the Word of God, through the Word of God, by the material that God has blessed us with, what would happen? Every church in the city of Houston, every church across the country going through Kingdom Man, Manhood Restored, 33 series, investing in men, the one that God originally called, just like he did Adam, and gave him a divine work, gave him a divine word and a divine wife, to take on leadership that God had given him and entrusted him with. And when you get a band of brothers saying, we're willing to fight for that, we're willing to say, we want to be men that don't discuss the problem, but we're the solution to the problem. If you really ask a man about his hobbies, whether they're fishermen or whether they are hunters or whatever it is that they do, golf, those guys can tell you about that because they're so well prepared. They're literate on that subject. And normally men get together and talk about that stuff, but let's get together this weekend and talk about the Word of God. Let's get together this weekend and get built up in the faith. One of the best ways to build men in churches is to pull us away from women and have our own times together where none of us have to be embarrassed, none of us have to be afraid, but to all get equipped together in the Word of God to be everything that God has called us to do. And the best way to do that, brothers, is to come together around the Word of God. We're so proud of these great dynamic speakers that God has gifted us with throughout the years that have material like Kingdom Man, Dr. Tony Evans' material, like Manhood Restored, Dr. Eric Mason's material, and 33 series by Tierce Green, John Bryson, and Brian Carter. Those guys have given us some excellent material, but there's even more coming, that guys are putting together things that we can actually go to, look at, and be trained as men privately, and then come out in publicly and be the men that God has called us to be, so that we'll be ready to fight for our families, to fight for our wives, fight for our children, to fight for our church, and in essence, to fight the good fight of faith.